Hello, and yes, my voice is a little scratchy, but at least I can talk now. So I'm going to forge on and talk a little bit about women in the Victorian era, and I also want to explore the times before the Victorian era. In this class, or in any class, you, the students, are reading the material and reading the background on it, reading aspects that are discussed in the module, and so on and so on. And so I like to give background because that may be something that of which you are not aware, or something that you would not complete research on unless you were going to specifically write about that topic. So I like to give background and talk about aspects that I feel are not totally covered either in the text or in the module overview, or what you might encounter in just reading the texts that are assigned. And so before I talk about aspects in the Victorian era, I want to talk about what had happened in the Renaissance and leading up to some of the, I keep getting pop-ups, sorry, leading up to some of the ideas in the Victorian era, and how those prior views influenced what people did see in the Victorian era. And again, I want to return to the Renaissance, which of course was the age of enlightenment. But there is the question, was there a Renaissance for women? Women were not seen as being equal to men in the Renaissance. And as far as writing goes, which is the focus of this class, of course, is the literature of the Victorian era, women did write. Upper class women and noble women were taught to read and write. And further back during the Middle Ages, some women were taught to read, but not to write. And you might wonder, how would that happen? If they could read, why wouldn't they be taught to write? And couldn't they teach themselves? Yes, they could. But the reason why in the Middle Ages and earlier women were not taught to write was because writing was dangerous. A woman of, even though there was not really a middle class in the Middle Ages, there was a merchant class, for example, and women were also women who had households, larger households, were expected to take care of aspects within the household. So they needed to read, they needed to maybe do a little math in order to keep sums, especially women who worked in inns and taverns and so on. So they needed to read, but writing would have given them the ability to express themselves, not just reading or reading for the purpose of keeping reading books, ads, well, I won't say ads, but reading the basics and being able to do sums, to being able to express themselves in writing, because women were not supposed to have a voice. Women in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and in the Victorian era, and even well into the 20th century, got their status from first their fathers and then their husbands. They were expected to be subservient, and they were expected to agree with the men in their lives, and therefore, why did they need to write when they weren't supposed to have a voice and to be expressing themselves? So in the Renaissance, I think that more women, I'm not an expert on the Renaissance, but more women were taught to read and write, but their modes of writing were severely limited. And even though some women did write quite a bit and were what we might call early feminist, they were relegated in the area of poetry to writing elegies, and just did not have a lot of freedom of expression. In the Victorian era, this continued, even though we did see more women writers. But remember, those women writers, even in the Romantic era and leading into the Victorian era, used male pseudonyms. The Brontes did it. And even Mary Shelley, she wrote Frankenstein, well, it was published in 1818, and then it was republished in 1831. People could not believe that a woman had written that, and there were several reasons why. One is because Percy, her husband, edited it, And so some of the diction in that novel is more of a university or college educated person, and women weren't college educated and are university educated. And so there was that doubt. And then the other doubt was, how could a woman, especially a woman as young as Mary Shelley, possibly have these complicated ideas? And even now, to this day, the theory persists that Mary doesn't write it, but I did my master's thesis in part on Frankenstein, and yeah, she wrote it. Yeah, Percy edited it. Yeah, I'm sure Percy made suggestions, etc. But the idea, the novel was based on a dream Mary had, and I have no doubt that she did not write this novel. It was, many of the things in her life were implicit in it. But back to the Renaissance. I particularly want to talk about Renaissance because ideas in the Renaissance persisted on for a very long time. The humoral theory of medicine, and this goes back to Hippocrates, this was nothing new in the Renaissance, that the body was made up of humors, and men were hot and dry, and women were cold and wet, influenced how the health of women and men were perceived, because men were hot and dry, they could burn off ill vapors and be healthier physically than women, whereas women being cold and wet could not do that. Women expelled their bad humors through menstruation. And this is one of the reasons why older women and younger women were seen as more volatile and unstable as women who were of childbearing age, because they did not menstruate and could not burn off those bad vapors. In particular, older women got the brunt of this, because remember, in the witch burnings, it was largely 75% of the women, people executed as witches were women, and about 75% of them were old women. But beyond that aspect of the humoral theory, which continued on into the modern age, my mother bought into the humoral theory. The dissection, vivisection had been forbidden, and they did start doing that secretly in the Renaissance, but it affected how women, the reproductive system of women were perceived. Men were the superior physically. That was just well established for many centuries. And women were inferior replicas of men. Aristotle said this. Aristotle said that nature made a mistake when she made women, which seems like an inherent contradiction, but we'll leave Aristotle alone. A woman's reproductive system was seen to be the same as a man's, except it was inversed. So the ovaries were seen as the scrotum, and the uterus was an inverted penis. Just that simple. And so the physical aspects of having that inside and being an echo of men's also had its ramifications in other areas. It was thought that women had to have an orgasm in order to get pregnant. This is also where the aspect of we saw in politics recently, where a politician talked about a woman has a way of shutting down her body so she doesn't get pregnant when she's raped. That goes back to that theory that a woman had to have an orgasm in order to get pregnant. So if she's raped and she gets pregnant, that means that she enjoyed it. I have nothing more to say about that silliness. But because of this, women were encouraged to have good sex so they would get pregnant, because according to the Catholic Church, sex, the primary reason for having sex was to procreate. And if the procreation did not happen, then there was something going on there, and when people shouldn't have been trying to procreate. This theory carried on until the vivisection started, and the examination of how women's reproductive organs really are, and also the invention of the microscope, which was I can't remember the time that it was invented, but by the Victorian era had been, I won't say perfected, but it certainly had become much better. And then it was discovered that ovaries produced eggs. And so with that understanding, it was understood that women could get pregnant under any circumstance, as long as the egg and the ova were to meet. And so that changed the idea of women and whether or not they should enjoy sex. And for centuries, women were seen as highly licentious and carnal creatures. They were seen as the carnal sex, as a matter of fact. And the myths of the succubi hold this to be true. And they were just perceived as being the temptresses because of that. In the Victorian era, that changed. And while there was a huge division between the poor women and the rich women, and as I had talked about this before, rich women and noble women sometimes didn't know how babies were made. The poor people knew. And again, as I noted in an earlier video, poor women were often pregnant when they got married, and we know this because of the records that we have, the birth and the marriage records. So by the Victorian era, this concept of women's sexuality had changed, and it became, the society became very moralistic, but it wasn't practiced. The morality was not practiced, and as I noted before as well, there were more brothels in London during the Victorian era than there ever were before. There were child prostitutes, and there were just all sorts of things going on there that we would find abhorrent in our society, but which are still continuing in our present society. But this affected how women were perceived with their sexuality, their reproductive issues, and so on. We talk about abortion today, and within the Victorian era, abortion was certainly taking place as it had been taking place for ages. And I'm not going to go into this because I know this is a touchy subject, but there were stronger laws enacted against abortion during the Victorian era, but it didn't stop the abortions from occurring. And women sometimes often did not see that self-induced abortions in the first trimester, that there was anything wrong with that. And I'm getting that information from this, and I will will create a works cited page for this book, because this is where some of my information is coming from, and some information is coming from other books that I've read and lectures that I had as a grad student and as an undergrad student. This is up to 12 minutes. I'm going to stop here, but I have more to say, so I will be back. If I can turn this off.